Welcome to part 2 of our introductory lecture to Intro to Philosophy. So in part 2 of the lecture, we're going to continue our introduction to the course and the subject matter that we're going to be studying by taking a look at the methods of philosophy. We're going to be taking a look at the way that philosophers actually study the material and the way that they tackle the kinds of questions that we talked about last time. So, before we actually get to any of the questions, before we actually get into the subject matter of the class, what I want to do is essentially give you a mental toolkit that you can use to better break down and understand the readings. This is going to involve clarifying some terminology that everyone uses, as in everyone in philosophy, not everyone on Earth. And it's also going to equip you to start analyzing the readings in a certain way. Now, this sort of thing will be continued in the next lecture, How to Read and Write Philosophy. But these tools will be used to help analyze the content of those readings, and so you kind of need both together. So while this next section may be a little dry, since we don't go to any of the mind-blowing questions or the really interesting discussions that we'll get to in the rest of the semester, I guarantee that you'll find it useful. In fact, in past versions of this class, this has been the section that students have said was the most helpful overall. And it's basically a miniature version of an Intro to Logic course. And hopefully you find it very useful. Now, the reason why I say it's an Intro to Logic course is because philosophy doesn't use experiments to figure out its questions, usually. There's a handful of folks who try and do that sort of thing. But their outlook on success is, a little mixed. Instead, what most philosophers do is simply apply reason and a few different kinds of analysis to different fundamental concepts and ideas and theories. Most of our questions simply aren't the kinds of things that experiments can test. For example, our knowledge example from the first half of the lecture. If we were to try and go out and survey people, we would just get what people think knowledge is, not necessarily what it actually is or what kind of standards we should be using. Similarly, experimentation can't ever definitively prove whether human beings are free or determined, or whether we're physical or non-physical beings. The fact that certain parts of those questions involve non-physical things that you can't get at through physical observation or experimentation rules that out as a method of inquiry. Instead, what philosophers usually do is they use reason to clarify and evaluate ideas, as well as compare theories and see which ones are best. An analogy that kind of makes sense is even if you can't get into a locked room to find out what's in it, even if you can't just directly see what's hidden from your view, you can use reason and the analysis of different proposals to rule out things that can't be there, or to find likely candidates and try and compare which ones would be best. In the case of some of the questions that we'll never be able to directly observe or prove, this is a really good way of ruling out bad ideas and to still actually make progress in philosophy. So this involves a lot of making definitions, ruling things out, finding mistakes, and a lot more. But to do this, we all tend to use a handful of very basic tools and concepts in common. The first of these involves the notion of an argument. Most of what philosophers do revolves around making arguments for various positions. And by this I don't mean a kind of verbal fight that you've got with somebody else. Instead, when I'm talking about an argument, I mean a statement that's supported by reasons. And to use a particular technical jargon, that means having a conclusion that's supported by premises. If you look here on your screen, there's a classic example that shows up in almost every intro logic course taught by man. So, we have all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, and therefore Socrates is mortal. If you notice, we've got a statement here that's sort of the thing being proven, the Socrates is mortal. This is the conclusion part of the argument, and it's supported by the first two lines. These are the premises, the reasons that we can say with some amount of confidence that Socrates is mortal. Thus, 1 and 2 are labeled the premises, and 3 is labeled the conclusion. I know this seems a little simple maybe, but some people actually have a surprising amount of trouble with this, and that's okay. Feel free to take these lectures slowly, go piece by piece, go over the examples, and if you have questions, pause the video, write them down, and shoot it off an email to me. Be more than happy to help. And that goes for any aspect of these, not just this first discussion. Now, identifying arguments is unfortunately not the only thing that we can do. We also need to be able to classify arguments. Now, arguments come in a few different varieties. Some try and give conclusive, rock-solid evidence for their conclusions. This is a lot like the Socrates example. Everything in this seems to be a very tight conceptual connection. It's laid out in such a way that if the premises are true, then the conclusion is guaranteed to be true. There's no way that the premises could be true and the conclusion false. These kinds of arguments with this tight conceptual connection that try and give conclusive, rock-solid evidence are called deductive arguments, or deductive. We're just talking about them and not stressing the first syllable. Other arguments only try and give some looser support for their conclusions. They make it so that if the premises are true, then the conclusion's probably true, and it's not guaranteed. These are called inductive arguments. You actually use both varieties of arguments almost every day. Deductive is a lot less common, but inductive is a very common aspect of human reasoning. These are going to be arguments and inferences, that is, bits of reasoning trying to reach a conclusion. These are going to be inferences like, well, the Taco Bell down the street screwed up my burrito the last 3 times I went, so they'll probably screw it up tomorrow too. That's an example of an inductive argument. It's going to be something that gives reasons for a conclusion, but it's still not guaranteed that the thing you're trying to prove will actually be true. It just gives support for it. It makes it likely that it will be true. But let's go into a little more detail so you can see what I mean about these two different kinds of arguments. In particular, there are certain features of the arguments that we can use to evaluate them. Because it's not enough just to identify arguments, say, oh, well, he's making an argument for that claim, and he's making an argument for that claim. That's one of the best skills you can have, but we also need to be able to say whether those arguments are good or bad. That is, we need to be able to see whether those arguments are convincing, whether they give us good reasons to believe the thing that they're arguing for. And for deductive arguments, there's a couple of properties in particular that we can start looking for. And if the argument has these, then we can say that it's a good argument. The most basic thing we can say about these is whether they're valid or invalid. Now, I'm not meaning that the argument's making a decent point, but rather something more technical. An argument is valid in the case that if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. This is part of what makes it a deductive argument. If it's not valid, it's not a successful deductive argument. But what I'm meaning here is that an argument is valid if the premises are true and the conclusion cannot possibly be false. The premises sort of guarantee that the conclusion is true. Another way to express this is that the argument is called truth-preserving. True premises go in and true conclusions come out. This is the sort of thing where we really just don't care about arguments that don't lead us to true conclusions. Nobody wants to waste their time on reasoning that doesn't give you a right answer. If you're trying to, suppose you had a doctor who looked at all of your symptoms and then gave you a diagnosis that may or may not match those symptoms. Kind of a useless doctor, isn't he? Well, in our case, the same thing's true of arguments. If an argument can look at all the evidence, but it doesn't give you a true conclusion, there's really not much point in bothering with it. So, an argument is valid if it can move for certain in a guaranteed way from true conclusions to from true premises to true conclusions, And that only happens if it's impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. Now, an argument is invalid if this isn't the case. If it is possible that the premises are true and the conclusion false, then it's an invalid argument. Okay, let's look at some examples. I know this is a lot to swallow all at once. So let's work through our Socrates example again. This is the 3-line argument on your screen. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. If we want to evaluate the argument, we ask ourselves, is it valid or invalid? To find out, we can simply see whether it's possible to have true premises and a false conclusion. If so, it's invalid. Otherwise, it is valid. So, is it possible for all men to be mortal and Socrates to be a man, and it be false that Socrates is mortal? That is it false that Socrates is going to have a finite lifespan just like every other man? That really doesn't seem to be the case. If every man on earth is mortal, and Socrates is one of those, if he's part of that group, then it doesn't seem to be any rational way that he could be both a man and immortal. And that's the only way that 3 is going to turn out false. So, if Socrates could live forever, then 1's actually false. And it's not the case that all men are mortal, it's all men but Socrates would be mortal. So basically, it's impossible for 1 and 2 to be true and 3 to be false. So this is an example of a valid argument. But in case you're still kind of fuzzy, again, I know this is quick. Let's take a look at another one. Some girls are blonde. Sophia is a girl. Therefore, Sophia is blonde. Is this valid? If you look through it and think about it, hopefully you can start to see that it's not. Being a girl doesn't guarantee that Sophia is a blonde, nor does the fact that some girls are blonde, and the combination is no better. It's true that some girls are blonde, most of you probably know at least somebody, and suppose that it's true that Sophia is a girl. Neither of those guarantee the truth of our conclusion, the statement we're trying to prove, that Sophia is a blonde. Sophia might be a brunette, she might be a redhead, she might have taken some really weird gene treatment so she can't grow hair anymore. 1 and 2 don't guarantee the truth of 3. It's possible for 3 to be false, for Sophia to not be blonde, and for 1 and 2 to still be true. Because that combination's possible, because it's possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false, this is an invalid argument. It doesn't guarantee the truth of its conclusion, if the premises were true. So, in this way, we can say that there's something wrong with this argument. This is one of the ways that a deductive argument can be bad. But it's not the only thing to look for. An argument can be valid and still bad in other ways. So consider this one. My Subaru has 4-wheel drive. If a car has 4-wheel drive, it can fly. Therefore, my Subaru can fly. Hopefully this strikes you as a little strange. Based on the meaning of Subaru, 4-wheel drive, and fly, this conclusion that my Subaru can fly because it's got 4-wheel drive, hopefully that sounds a little strange. But an interesting thing is, this is a valid argument. If it is the case that my Subaru has 4-wheel drive, and if my car has 4-wheel drive, it can fly, if both of those are true, then 3 must be true. I've set up these broad classes and said that my car belongs to that one, and we just work out the implications from there. But, in case you didn't know, my Subaru can't actually fly. For one, I don't even have a Subaru, so the phrase my Subaru is not a good one. But also, no car, as far as I know, could fly. Otherwise, you're reading this in the post-flying car future, and I hope that you've survived the innumerable wrecks that would ensue. Godspeed to you. But the point is, despite this argument being valid, it's not a sound argument. It doesn't have both a true conclusion and true premises. We say an argument's sound when it's a valid argument and every part of it is true. In this case, it's actually the opposite. Every line's false. And for the record, just something to keep straight, only valid arguments can be sound. If an argument is valid, or if it's invalid, let's back up. If an argument is valid, but it has either false premises or a false conclusion or both, then it's unsound. And it's also unsound if it's an invalid argument. So, again, let's look at some examples to try and illustrate this sort of thing. Let's take a look at the Socrates one again, because, it's a classic. All men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Now, it's true that every man is mortal. Every single one of us has a finite lifespan and will die at some point. It's also true that Socrates was a man. We have quite a lot of historical documentation on the guy. Now, it's also true, because of the same documentation we know, that Socrates died. So it seems safe to say that the idea that Socrates is mortal is true. Therefore, we've already proven that the argument is valid, but it also has a true conclusion and true premises. That fits all 3 of our requirements for an argument being sound. So, it is sound, and thus it shows that it's a good deductive argument. It starts with true premises and gets to a true conclusion, if it had those, and it turns out it does have true premises and a true conclusion. Therefore, this argument leads us reliably from true things to true things, and thus it's very useful for us. This gives good reasons to think that Socrates is mortal. It's a very convincing type argument. Now, inductive arguments, unfortunately, we can't evaluate in the same way. They're very common in human reasoning, but because the conclusion isn't guaranteed by the premises, we can't say the same things about it. Instead of saying that it's valid or invalid, or that it's sound or unsound, all we can say is that the arguments are either strong or weak, depending on how well the premises can support the conclusion. So here I've tweaked our Socrates example a little bit. All the men I've met are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is probably mortal. You've probably noticed, reference intended, that I've tweaked the lines of this to where it's no longer quite as guaranteed that the conclusion is true based on the premises. We've added in some other words that make it possible that the conclusion is false. All the men I've met are mortal. There could be others I've not met. Socrates is probably mortal, not that Socrates definitely is mortal. This is a pretty strong argument. The premises make it very likely the conclusion is true because, all my observations have been consistent. I've probably met an awful lot of men over my life. So it's also very likely the case that Socrates is probably mortal as well. The premises support the conclusion quite a lot. So this is a good example of a strong argument, but it's not a valid argument or a sound argument. Those are the wrong kinds of ideas to apply to this. Again, let's look at some more examples and see if we can make this a little clearer. How about this one? Sophia was in the football stadium today. Someone scored a touchdown today. Therefore, Sophia scored a touchdown today. This is quite a lot weaker than our Socrates example. Let's suppose that it's true that Sophia was in the football stadium and it's true that someone scored a touchdown today. Do these really support the idea? Does it make it likely to be true that Sophia is the one who scored the touchdown? Well, probably not. If there was any real event going on, any real reason for people to be at the stadium in the first place, Sophia was probably one of many thousands of people in that stadium. Even high school stadiums can at least support several hundred to 1,000 or 2 people. Not all, but a lot. And so her simply being there, the idea of premise 1, doesn't connect up well to think that she's the person who scored the touchdown talked about in premise 2. So the premises, lines 1 and 2, they don't support line 3 very well. They do a little bit. It's more likely that Sophia scored the touchdown today because she was there than if she'd been, say, in Hawaii or something, thousands of miles away from the stadium. So it does support it a little bit. It's not just totally off, but the argument's still a very weak argument, and hopefully you can start to see this. Now, some arguments, some inductive arguments, deserve a special mention because they happen so often, and they're very, very useful. And we can use this both as an example of this new kind and of a strong argument. Now, these kinds of things are called inference to the best explanation, or abduction. These kinds of arguments try and fit the conclusion as best they can to the facts, even though there's no guarantee that it's correct, or that it's the only conclusion supported by the facts. So let's re-look at our old example. Sophia was in the football stadium today. Someone scored a touchdown today. There was no one else besides Sophia near the end zone, and Sophia was celebrating after the touchdown was confirmed. Therefore, Sophia scored a touchdown today. Now, again, this is still an inductive argument. Lines 1 through 4 do not guarantee that 5 is true, but it certainly seems much stronger. All the different lines that we have form a tighter network of support. They better support the conclusion. But the reason why this is an inference to the best explanation is because there's a lot of reasons why 1 through 4 could be true. Suppose that Sophia just really, really likes someone who's near the end zone, and she's celebrating because they scored the touchdown. Of course, they would have to be not very near the touchdown. Maybe it was a weird Hail Mary pass, or there was a teleporting football player or something. Because line 3 tells us that no one besides Sophia was there. But the point is that I can start telling other very unlikely stories about what's going on. The idea that Sophia scored the touchdown today is probably the best explanation for what happened in lines 1 through 4. And so, this is both an example of a strong argument, which can be of any type of inductive argument, whether it's inference to the best explanation or not. But this is also an example of inference to the best explanation, because it comes up with a conclusion that best fits the other 4, even though there are other possible alternatives. Now, unfortunately, arguments in the future won't really have the same very clearly labeled format, at least not always. Sometimes they will, but they can take a lot of different forms in our readings. So at this point, I think the best thing you can do is actually just continue to practice this. Some arguments are subtle, sometimes they're obvious, sometimes it's real easy to tell what they're arguing for, and sometimes they're not. So actually, as this part of the lesson, I'd like you to get away from the lectures for a little bit and turn to your textbook. There's actually some excellent practice in the reading labeled Excursus, A Little Bit of Logic, and a lot of the topics that we've talked about in this lecture come from it. So if you haven't done so yet, make sure that the next reading you tackle is the Excursus, A Little Bit of Logic part of the textbook, and actually do the exercises that show up. You don't have to worry about the kinds of reasoning section where it discusses things like modus ponens and modus tollens. That's beyond the purview of this class. But in terms of the identifying arguments and the rest, I do want you to actually do those exercises. They won't be graded, but it's going to be very, very useful for you, I promise. So that wraps up this one. I'll see you next time, and happy arguing.